Okay, imagine this. You turn on your radio tonight, maybe looking for some music, and a panic voice breaks through. Martians, it says. Martian tripods have landed just outside New York City. And the broadcast, it sounds completely real. You hear screams, explosions in the background. What would you even do? Well, back in 1938, thousands of people didn't really have to imagine it. They lived it, or, well, they thought they did. For this one terrifying hour on Halloween Eve, many believed America was actually under attack by some kind of unknown, unstoppable enemy. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most infamous moments in media history, the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts, the brainchild of the legendary Orson Welles. Our mission isn't just to revisit, a thrilling old story. We want to use it as a lens, a really powerful one. We'll look at how susceptible we all can be to deception, the complex psychology of crowds, and how media itself keeps evolving. We're going to really unpack how Welles crafted this incredible illusion, look into the often misunderstood reality of how the public actually reacted, and maybe most importantly, uncover the psychological principles that made it hit so hard. And we'll draw some pretty clear parallels to our own media world today.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating really is that this isn't just some historical anecdote or a dusty bit of radio trivia. It's a profound real-world case study in human psychology. Yeah. And it's still incredibly relevant for understanding how we navigate information right now. We're going to be talking about these fundamental cognitive shortcuts, right? Yeah. Those automatic mental processes sort of hardwired into our brains. And it's not about how smart someone is or how educated. These are just universal things, how we all process information. So throughout this deep dive, we'll be looking really closely at key cognitive biases like authority bias and social proof. These aren't just fancy academic terms. They were powerful forces back in 1938, shaping what people believed. And honestly, they still influence how we consume information and react to things, even with everything being digital now.
Okay, let's get into it. How did a simple radio play, just a piece of fiction, manage to convince so many people that the world was ending? Literally. It all starts October 30th, 1938, Halloween night. Kind of the perfect backdrop, isn't it? Eerie.
Absolutely perfect timing.
The program was the Mercury Theater on the Air, broadcast on the CBS radio network, and the mastermind. And then 23-year-old, frankly brilliant, Orson Welles. He wasn't just directing and narrating, he was acting too, a lead actor, lending that distinctive voice of his to several roles, including Professor Pearson, who's central to the story.
And the source material, of course. H.G. Wells' 1897 novel, The War of the Worlds, classic Martian invasion story. But the real stroke of genius, you could say, was in the adaptation by Howard Koch. He made this crucial, really audacious shift. He moved the setting from, 19th century England, kind of a safe historical distance, to contemporary 20th century America.
Right, bringing it right into people's backyards.
Exactly. Suddenly, the threat felt incredibly close. The first Martian spacecraft famously lands in the very real, very rural Grover's Mill, West Windsor, New Jersey. This wasn't some far-off fantasy land. It was a real place, somewhere listeners could actually picture. Maybe they'd even driven through it.
And that's where the crafting of the illusion itself gets, well, truly remarkable. Wells had this brilliant kind of audacious idea. He decided to present the first 2/3 of the hour-long play, not like a normal drama, with a clear beginning, but as a simulated live newscast. Just picture it. You're listening, maybe you just tuned away from another show, and suddenly, bam, breaking news bulletins interrupt the dance music. They even had a fictional orchestra, right? Ramon Raquello and his orchestra playing Stardust or something.
Yeah, exactly. That contrast was jarring. Relaxing music, then panic. And this wasn't entirely out of the blue, format-wise. Wells was definitely inspired by some earlier things. There was Ronald Knox's 1926 BBC radio hoax, Broadcasting the Barricades, about a fictional communist uprising in London. That fooled some people. And a similar Australian invasion drama back in 1927. Plus, Wells knew the format well. He'd used newscast elements in other Mercury Theater shows and was familiar with the CBS News documentary series The March of Time, which specialized in those dramatic reenactments of news events.
Ah, The March of Time. Right, so listeners were kind of primed for that style.
They were. So this immersive pseudo-documentary format Wells used, it just immediately gave it this air of urgent realism. It was completely disarming for many people tuning in.
Okay, so the format grabs you. But how did they make the details so believable?
Well, that immersive format was boosted by what you could call authenticity markers, little cues, familiar things, that deliberately blurred the line between fiction and reality. So the broadcast opened with this brief sort of literary preface from the novel. But then, boom, it quickly shifted into what sounded like a typical Sunday evening radio show. You got a weather report, some orchestral music, Then the first interruptions started.
And the fake experts. That was key, right?
Oh, absolutely crucial. The script subtly introduced these fictional characters, but presented them as real experts. You had Professor Richard Pearson, the astronomer, played by Welles himself, sounding very academic, Professor Indel Farrell, another astronomer, and the commentator, Carl Phillips. Now, it's important to remember, none of these guys were actually in H.G. Wells's original book.
Right, Welles and Cuff added them.
Yes, but their introduction, with these calm, authoritative voices that then got increasingly frantic, it just provided this immediate, seemingly legitimate layer of credibility to everything that was unfolding.
And they didn't just rely on the fake experts. They used real places, too.
Meticulously.
Right.
They incorporated recognizable real-world locations. You heard names like Grover's Mill, Princeton, Trenton, New York City, Washington, D.C. These were places listeners knew, places they could easily picture. Imagine hearing a report that this Martian cylinder had landed just down the road. Exactly. Now, interestingly, CBS's legal department did make a few tweaks. They were probably a bit nervous. So they changed the Hotel Biltmore to the Park Plaza. The New Jersey National Guard became the state militia. Small changes.
To avoid getting sued, presumably.
Probably.
Yeah.
But Welles later said these minor changes actually made the play more acceptable to American listeners, he thought. It kept it grounded in this recognizable American landscape, but just slightly anonymized. It shows how much thought went into it, really, understanding their audience.
And the actors, they had to sell it too. They couldn't just sound like they were reading a script.
No way. And under Wells's direction, they were masterful. They meticulously mimicked that urgent, on-the-scene reporting style that people recognize from real events.
Right.
Think about the Hindenburg disaster in '37. Reporter Herb Morrison's broadcast of that. I mean, it was raw, terrifying.
Oh, the humanity. Everyone knew that voice.
Exactly. It was seared into people's minds. And the March of Time had even restaged parts of reports like that, so listeners were familiar with that breathless, dramatic style. Wells's actors, especially Frank Reddick Jr. playing Carl Phillips, the reporter whose voice gets more and more desperate, they nailed it. That escalating panic, the breathless delivery, it sounded exactly like genuine breaking news.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how the performance of realism, the way they constructed that authenticity through voice and framing, becomes so convincing.
It wasn't just the acting, though. You mentioned sound design earlier. That must have been huge for radio.
Oh, absolutely revolutionary for the time. The sound effects chief, Ora D. Nichols, and her team. They were geniuses. They didn't just add background noise. They crafted these subtle, detailed audio cues that just dropped the listener right into the middle of the chaos.
Like what specifically? Well, think about the crackle of an old radio, maybe simulating a bulletin breaking through bad reception, the rustle of a newspaper, the sound of crowds murmuring, then building to screams, police sirens wailing off in the distance, getting closer, gunshots that sounded chillingly real. Boat whistles, church bells, even just human sounds like coughing, panic breathing, the thud of, bodies falling.
Wow. And the Martian sounds, the heat ray, the machines.
They got creative. The iconic sound of the Martian heat ray. Reportedly, they just opened and closed a metal coffee can lid right in front of the microphone. Simple, but effective. And the monstrous clanking footsteps of the tripod war machines, apparently achieved by banging a toilet plunger inside a hollow box.
No way. A toilet plunger.
That's the legend. It shows how resourceful they were. These sounds weren't just background fluff. They were crucial for creating this visceral, immediate, completely convincing illusion.
And the dialogue tied it all together.
Ingeniously. It was written specifically to create urgency and this vivid sense of physical space, of tension. Like you hear Professor Pearson speaking off mic for a second before moving closer, implying he just rushed in or he's adjusting himself. Or the reporter, Carl Phillips, asking the farmer, Mr. Wilmoth, at the landing site, "Step closer to the mic, please, and speak louder," because there's this background chaos you imagine, armed police, onlookers milling around.
It paints a picture in your mind.
Exactly. These small details, like Phillips describing the Martian cylinder splitting open like a great metal spider, it just created this vivid, chaotic, terrifying scene for the listener. You weren't just being told a story, you were sort of invited to experience it, to imagine yourself right there.
And the story itself just built and built. The panic escalated.
Oh, it was a masterclass in escalating tension. The broadcast just unfolded relentlessly with these news updates detailing this devastating invasion. You hear about the military trying to fight back, but it's futile. The brave New Jersey state militia charging in, only to be wiped out. Then the release of the poisonous black smoke from these towering Martian war machines.
And the ending of that first half, the reporter on the roof.
Utterly chilling. You hear this correspondent, presumably Carl Phillips, describing people fleeing the poison smoke at a Manhattan rooftop. His voice gets more and more strained till he chokes out something like, 20 yards away. Good heavens, something's wriggling out of the smoke. Like a great snake. It's coming this way. Two luminous eyes coming straight for me. Ah, the smoke. Then he coughs. A horrible sound. And just silence. Dead air.
Just dead air. That must have been terrifying.
Imagine. Followed by the somber voice of an announcer back in the studio, struggling to keep it together. And throughout all this, they kept addressing the audience directly, using ladies and gentlemen, but also just you. It created this deeply personal, immediate connection. You felt like you were in it, a direct witness to the apocalypse.
Which brings us back to radio itself. It wasn't just a medium, it was the medium back then, right?
Absolutely crucial context. In the 1930s, deep in the Great Depression, lots of people were out of work, at home. Radio was affordable. It was their primary source for everything entertainment and news. It created this unique sense of national community, this collective experience. Think of FDR's fireside chats.
Right. He used radio to calm the nation during the banking crisis.
Exactly. He spoke directly into people's living rooms, restored trust. Radio felt immediate, intimate. It transcended distance. Its immateriality, as some call it, bringing news and stories directly into homes. It made it uniquely powerful. It was the most ubiquitous, most trusted, most pervasive medium of its time, woven into daily life. Understanding that deep societal reliance on radio, that's essential to understanding why the broadcast hit so hard.
Okay, so after all that masterful, terrifying deception, how did it finally unravel? How did people realize it wasn't real?
Well, you might think there was no warning, but there were actually self-corrections built into the broadcast itself. They weren't trying to cause a permanent panic, arguably. The first really official disclaimer, the one explicitly saying, this is CBS presenting Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air, adapting H.G. Wells' novel. That came about 30 minutes in.
30 minutes? That seems kind of late after all the chaos had started.
It was, and the timing is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
See, many listeners probably tuned in late. Maybe they were listening to the really popular comedy show on NBC, The Chasen Sanborn Hour, with Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy.
Ah, the competition.
Exactly. So if you tuned in, say, 15 or 20 minutes late, you missed Wells's very brief initial introduction at the absolute start of the hour. For those latecomers, that first half hour was just relentless, realistic news bulletins. By the time that official disclaimer finally arrived around the halfway mark, just before a short break, for some people, the illusion was already completely set. The fear was real.
And the second half of the show changed tone, too.
Dramatically. It shifted to a much more conventional radio drama format. It followed a lone survivor, played by Welles, wandering through this devastated landscape. It sounded much more like storytelling, less like a live news report.
And then Welles himself broke character at the very end.
He did. After all that chilling performance, he came back on out of character, completely breaking the fourth wall. He playfully compared the whole thing to dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying, boo.
A Halloween prank.
Basically, yeah. He acknowledged it was a scare for the season. And just to be sure, CBS repeated announcements confirming it was fiction later that night, 10:30, 11:30, midnight. Plus, the Sunday newspapers had listed The War of the World as a play in their radio schedules. So the information was out there.
But the immediate impact was still chaotic.
Oh, complicated is putting it mildly. For CBS, the immediate aftermath was absolute chaos. Their building in New York was swamped, inundated with police and press, as reports said. The phone switchboard, described as a vast sea of light, calls pouring in from everywhere, worried families, police departments wanting answers, news desks scrambling.
And Welles himself.
He was apparently overwhelmed, initially felt his career was over, reportedly lamented, "I'm through." Meanwhile, the news ticker in Times Square flashed. Orson Welles causes panic. Talk about instant notoriety.
Wow. And the next day,
he held this hastily arranged press conference. Looked quite contrite, apparently. Said he definitely not intended to cause terror, admitted the technique wasn't totally original, and apologized for using real American cities.
But the stories of panic were pretty wild initially, weren't they? People fleeing, hospitals filling up.
Incredibly dramatic stories hit the papers almost immediately. Thousands supposedly fleeing their homes in New Jersey. Motorists clogging the roads trying to escape. Hospitals allegedly flooded with people suffering from shock and hysteria. Phone lines jammed to police and fire stations. Churches supposedly packed. There were even stories about National Guardsmen reporting for duty, thinking it was a real invasion. and these unverified tales of suicides.
And for some people, like those in Concrete, Washington, it felt incredibly real because of that coincidental power outage.
Exactly. For them, hearing the broadcast and then suddenly having the lights go out, you can imagine the terror. They genuinely thought the Martians, or maybe Germans or something awful, had arrived.
Okay, but this is where the story gets more complex, right? The whole idea of a nationwide panic, that's been questioned.
This is precisely where we need to dig deeper and be critical. That narrative of mass, nationwide hysteria.
Yeah.
It's largely disputed now. What's really interesting is how the newspapers covered it initially. Within just 3 weeks, you had over 12,500 articles running headlines about this national panic. But modern research, looking back at surveys, letters, other data, scholars like Verma, Pooley and Sokolow, Campbell, Schwartz, they paint a very different picture. They argue the panic was significantly less widespread than the newspapers claimed. Some even call the newspaper narrative overblown, hyperbolized, or even fabricated nonsense.
Fabricated nonsense? That's a strong accusation. Why would newspapers do that? What was their angle?
Well, you have to remember the context. The 1930s, the Great Depression, newspapers were struggling, advertising revenue was way down, and they saw radio as this huge competitor, this threat, stealing their audience and their ad dollars.
A media war.
Pretty much. They saw the War of the Worlds incident as a perfect opportunity to discredit radio, to paint it as irresponsible, dangerous, unreliable for news. So editorials nationwide slammed radio's recklessness. They basically used Welles's broadcast as ammunition to promote newspapers as the trustworthy, sober source of information. They fanned the flames of the panic story for strategic advantage.
So it wasn't necessarily millions fleeing in terror, but more like a story about millions fleeing in terror, amplified by a rival medium.
The evidence strongly suggests that. Contemporary surveys, like those by the C.E. Hooper Company, a big ratings firm, then found only about 2% of people surveyed were even listening to the Welles broadcast.
Only 2%.
Tiny fraction. And Hooper surveys found that among those who were listening, basically no one thought it was real news. Most people were tuned into that popular NBC comedy show instead. Frank Stanton, who later became president of CBS, even admitted most people didn't hear the show.
Okay, what about the letters people wrote? Did they show panic?
Researchers analyzed letters sent to Welles and the FCC. Only about 27% came from people who sounded genuinely frightened. And even those letters didn't consistently describe people fleeing or widespread chaos. Plus, the total number of complaint letters was actually pretty low compared to other controversial broadcasts around that time.
That really changes the popular image. But what about all those phone calls to police and newspapers? That sounds like panic.
That's a fair point, and it's nuanced. Yes, some police departments and newspapers, especially in New Jersey near Grover's Mill, did report a big spike in calls, maybe up to 40% more than usual. But some researchers look at that differently. Instead of blind hysteria, they see it as potentially a rational response.
Rational? How so?
Well, if you hear something terrifying and ambiguous on the radio, what do? You try to verify it. Calling the police or a newspaper is a logical way to check the facts, right? It suggests people were trying to make sense of it, seeking confirmation, not just running blindly into the streets. It shows an attempt to find clarity.
Okay, that makes sense. And the stories about hospitals and suicides.
Later investigations just couldn't verify those claims of widespread hospital admissions for shock or suicides directly caused by the broadcast. A lot of those sensational stories seem to have been part of that newspaper-driven narrative amplified over time.
So if the mass panic was largely a myth, or at least heavily exaggerated, what did make the people who were listening and did believe it so vulnerable? What was really going on psychologically?
That leads us to another crucial factor, the pre-existing social anxiety. Remember, late 1938 was a really tense time globally. The Munich crisis had just happened. Europe was on the brink of war. Americans were glued to their radios, listening anxiously to news from overseas. There was this background hum of fear.
So people were already primed for bad news.
Exactly. That pervasive unease meant that many listeners who did believe the broadcast wasn't necessarily about aliens from Mars. For some, the fear manifested as something more familiar, more immediate. Some thought it was a surprise German invasion. Others thought it was some kind of natural disaster. The broadcast tapped into those existing deep-seated fears. Paul White, who was the CBS News chief then, believed this general anxiety made the public highly susceptible. The broadcast landed on fertile ground for fear.
Okay, let's really unpack the psychology here. We know the nationwide panic story is likely overblown, but some people clearly did believe it. Why? You mentioned it wasn't because they were stupid. It was about these cognitive biases, right? And how the radio medium worked back then.
That's exactly right. The broadcast was like a masterclass in exploiting fundamental psychological principles. And understanding these helps us see this timeless blueprint of deception. The first big one is authority bias. This is basically a mental shortcut. We tend to defer to people or sources that seem like authorities. We assume their interpretation is more accurate or credible.
Like trusting a doctor's diagnosis without question.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Our brains are wired to do this, especially when things are uncertain or the stakes feel high. It saves mental energy. It's often useful, but it can definitely be exploited.
So how did Welles use authority bias so effectively in the broadcast?
In a few really powerful ways. First, just the medium itself was an authority. In 1938, radio was the dominant, most trusted source for immediate news. Period. It brought everything from entertainment to emergency alerts to FDR's chats right into your home. So when something came over the radio presented as a special bulletin, it just carried this inherent weight of legitimacy. People had learned to trust radio news implicitly.
And the voices they used? They sounded official.
Absolutely. They created meticulous performances of authority. Yeah. The actors sounded like professional announcers or reporters, calm at first, then increasingly believably frantic, like Carl Phillips. And they had these official-sounding figures. Professor Pearson, the measured astronomer, Professor Farrell, military guys like Brigadier General Montgomery Smith, even a Secretary of the Interior. Their language was precise, their tone serious, their descriptions detailed. When Professor Pearson calmly discussed the extraordinary phenomenon on Mars, or Phillips described the official party heading to Grover's Mill, these voices, with that carefully crafted gravitas that then dissolved into panic, just screamed expertise and legitimacy. It made it really hard to doubt them.
And the format itself, the interruptions.
Exactly. That news bulletin structure was instantly recognizable. It was the format for urgent, important, authoritative news. Hearing that familiar phrase, "We interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin," that immediately signaled, pay attention, this is real, this is important. That structure implicitly trumped any idea that this might be fiction for listeners who tuned in late. They were conditioned to accept that format as genuine breaking news.
Okay, so authority bias is huge. What was the other one you mentioned? Social proof.
Right, social proof, or sometimes called informational social influence. This is another really powerful psychological effect. Basically, in ambiguous situations, we look to others to figure out how to act. We copy their behavior, assuming they know more than we do.
Like if you see everyone else running from a building, you run too, even if you don't know why.
Precisely. And it's strongest when uncertainty is high, which it definitely was during the broadcast, and when we see others who seem similar to us or knowledgeable reacting, it can quickly snowball into herd behavior. And you don't just copy the behavior, you often genuinely start to believe what the others seem to believe.
So how did social proof work during War of the Worlds?
On multiple levels. First, the broadcast itself provided the social proof. It meticulously described widespread panic. Remember that reporter's description? People in the streets, they're running towards the East River, thousands of them dropping in like rats, they're falling like flies. Hearing those descriptions created this powerful sense of internal social proof. The story itself showed society breaking down, amplifying the listener's own confusion and fear. It felt like you were part of that terrified crowd.
And then that spilled over into the real world.
It seems likely. Even if the initial reports were exaggerated, any actual signs of panic, people calling neighbors, maybe seeing unusual traffic, hearing sirens, or even just hearing reports of panic from trusted local sources would create real-world cascades. Seeing or hearing about others reacting makes the threat seem much more real. It validates your own fear and makes you more likely to conform, maybe call the police yourself. And calling the police, while rational, also confirmed for that person. See? Others are panicking too. It reinforced the social proof loop.
And radio's nature helped this spread, that feeling of shared experience.
Definitely. Radio created what some scholars call an imagined community. Unlike reading a newspaper alone, listening to the radio felt simultaneous. When you heard that terrifying news, you implicitly assumed everyone else is hearing this exact same thing right now, and they must be reacting. Even though people were in separate homes, this created a sense of collective experience, a shared crisis unfolding in real time, which made the threat feel universal and much more immediate.
Beyond those biases, you also mentioned the media environment itself was key, how people perceived realism on the radio.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just the psychology. Think about Jonathan Stern's idea of the social genesis of sound fidelity. His point is that how real something sounds isn't just about the sound waves matching the source. It's more about our faith in the machines and the social systems delivering the sound. So the broadcast didn't just capture reality, it meticulously constructed realism. The actors, the sound effects guys, they performed realism for the microphone, for the network. They carefully produced sounds, crowds, gunshots that coffee can heat ray to achieve this effect of authenticity even in a studio. And radio's magic trick, its ability to transmit sound instantly, making it feel like there's no distance, that made these hallucinations become real, as the theorist Friedrich Kittler put it. It contributed hugely to the immediacy and believability.
So it wasn't just what they heard, but how they were used to trusting radio itself.
Exactly. Which connects to Lisa Gittelman's ideas about media publics and learned protocols. She argues that media often works best when we become kind of blind to the technology itself. Listeners in 1938 had learned how to listen to radio. They had an audience etiquette and certain protocols. They knew how news sounded, how drama sounded. These learned habits let the technology fade into the background. They were acculturated, as Gittelman says, to recognize certain cues, authoritative voices, bulletin formats as significant. They had a shared understanding of what counted as legitimate information via radio.
And Wells exploited those learned habits.
Masterfully. He made the mediation, the fact that it was a broadcast, a play, seemed to disappear. He made it sound like reality by perfectly mimicking the protocols of listening practices for news. It fit the mold, so people accepted it. And one more layer here from Friedrich Kittler again is the idea of discourse networks. Media technologies don't just deliver messages. They shape how we think, how society communicates. They create an entire ecosystem. The War of the Worlds broadcast tapped into that existing network, radio, telegraph, telephone, and then brilliantly and terrifyingly, it attacked those very networks within its own plot.
How do you mean?
The story itself depicted the communication infrastructure collapsing. Remember the reporter dying on the rooftop, followed by dead air? Or later, an announcer frantically trying to reach someone? Anyone. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? That wasn't just drama. It represented the potential obliteration of the real itself, the breakdown of the very system people relied on for information. It was an attack on the media environment they inhabited. As one scholar, Schwartz, noted, they weren't just listening to a broadcast about a broadcast, they were arguably listening to a broadcast broadcasting the devastation of their broadcast, their connection to informed reality crumbling live on air. That's profoundly unsettling.
Wow. Okay, this gets really interesting now. What does all this, the psychology, the media manipulation mean for us today? The technology is wildly different, obviously.
It is, but the core human psychology, the cognitive shortcuts, the vulnerabilities, they remain remarkably similar. The blueprint for deception hasn't changed that much.
So authority bias? How does that show up now?
Oh, everywhere. Often in even more sophisticated ways. Think about those incredibly convincing phishing emails. They look exactly like they're from your bank or maybe Amazon or the IRS. They leverage the perceived authority of the sender to trick you. Or think about fake medical cures or questionable financial advice pushed by, say, celebrity gurus or people who just sound like experts online.
Yeah, the source carries weight even if it's fake.
Exactly. Our brains still take that shortcut. Even things like deepfakes or AI-generated news anchors. They can exploit authority bias by presenting a convincing, authoritative-looking figure delivering complete fabrication. We're still wired to defer, especially when overwhelmed with information.
And social proof, that herd mentality, that must be amplified massively online.
Massively. Social proof in the digital age is basically the engine of virality. Every platform uses it. The number of followers, likes, shares, retweets, views, all these metrics make content appear more trustworthy, more credible, more popular, whether it is or not.
So if something has 1 million views, we assume it must be good or true.
Often, yeah. An account with tons of followers seems more reputable. It leads to faster growth, more engagement, regardless of whether the content is accurate or garbage. This creates information cascades online. Stuff goes viral based on perceived popularity, often without any real critical check. We've seen this with everything from political misinformation spreading like wildfire to dangerous viral challenges.
Like the fake tweet about the White House attack tanking the stock market for a bit.
Exactly. A perfect example of manufactured social proof, having real-world consequences. Influencers, trends, they're all built on this foundation of social proof.
So this whole fake news crisis we're always talking about, it's basically the War of the Worlds broadcast on digital steroids.
In many ways, yes. The ambiguity around fake news. Is it just wrong, misinformation, or deliberately deceptive disinformation? That echoes the confusion back in 1938. Today, you have bots and coordinated networks making false information go viral instantly, creating this artificial sense of consensus. Just like panicked rumors might have spread organically, but much faster and potentially more targeted. And the algorithms on platforms like Facebook, TikTok, Google, they track everything we do online to feed us more content that keeps us clicking and scrolling.
Creating echo chambers.
Precisely. Reinforcing our biases, shaving our sense of what's new or important, often prioritizing engagement over truth. Even the post now, correct later pressure in some modern journalism can lead to mistakes getting out fast, similar to maybe how a newspaper might have rushed a story in 1938 without full checking.
And we even see online trends causing weird real-world effects, like those TikTok tics you mentioned.
Yeah, reports of young people developing Tourette-like symptoms after watching videos about Tourette's. It highlights how collective anxieties, even physical behaviors, can manifest and spread rapidly through these networked environments. It's a kind of digital social contagion.
So what about media literacy? Trying to teach people to spot fake news, check sources. Does that help?
It's absolutely essential, don't get me wrong. We need critical thinking skills. But sometimes the discussion focuses too much on just spotting fake websites or checking sources. It sometimes implicitly tries to restore innate authority to traditional institutions without fully grappling with how authority is constructed and perceived now in this chaotic digital space. Just like in 1938, the problem isn't only the bad information, it's the whole ecosystem. The technology, our ingrained habits, our cognitive shortcuts, and the actors, both human and algorithmic, who exploit them. It's a systemic issue, not just about individual gullibility.
So the takeaway isn't just don't believe everything you read online.
Not at all. The really critical thing to grasp from this whole War of the World story is this. The technology evolves incredibly fast: radio tubes to fiber optics, broadcast towers to satellites and Wi-Fi. But the human cognitive biases, those mental shortcuts, those vulnerabilities, and the fundamental blueprint for how to deceive using media, those remain strikingly similar. Welles understood his medium radio inside and out, and used that understanding to create a powerful illusion. Today's creators of disinformation, whether it's state actors or just clickbait farms, understand their medium, social media, algorithms, AI just as well. They leverage the specific conditions of today's networks and our timeless psychological weaknesses.
So it leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? How do we, just regular people trying to stay informed, navigate this endless flood? How do we tell what's real time, what's genuinely new, when old stuff can be repackaged as new and new stuff can vanish instantly, all shaped by algorithms we don't even see? Maybe the deeper question isn't just what we're consuming online or on any media. Maybe it's how the entire environment and our own participation in it, clicking and sharing and reacting, how all of that is constantly shaping our perception of what reality even is. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. We've gone from a spooky Halloween prank that maybe didn't panic the entire nation, but certainly terrified some, all the way to the timeless lessons it holds for us right now. It's a really powerful reminder of how potent media can be and how complex and sometimes predictable our own minds are.
Yeah, the technology changes constantly, but that blueprint for deception, leveraging authority, playing on social proof, understanding the medium and the flaws, or maybe just the shortcuts in our own thinking, those seem pretty constant. So, stay skeptical, stay curious. Always question the narratives, especially the ones that seemed designed to provoke a strong, immediate reaction, no matter how authoritative they sound or how many people seem to believe them.
Great advice. Thanks everyone for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep thinking critically about the world around you.